today I'm going to look at, the paper is trying to evaluate whether some strategies by the Department of Labor have been effective in lowering improper payments. So just a taste of what's to come. I'm going to just give you a brief overview of the paper. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about unemployment insurance in case you're not specifically aware of how that program works. A brief history of unemployment insurance's relationship with improper payments, dating back a long time. Then we're going to talk about improper payments more broadly and how the federal government has put a renewed focus on this in the early 2000s. We'll look at what the Department of Labor's response to that was in this UIPL NO 19-11. I'll tell you what that is. And then some more traditional pieces that come along with the paper. We'll look at what other literature has been done on this, look through our data, our empirical methods, some of our results, a few robustness checks, and then cover the conclusion. And if I start, I'm going to try to rush to get through some of this. I'm going to try to keep it to about 20 or 30 minutes. If I start going too fast, someone just throw something at me. And if you have questions as I go, you don't have to hold your questions to the end. So if you see something and I don't explain it to your satisfaction, just raise your hand and I can stop. Okay, so in 2002, the U.S. federal government passed what is called the Improper Payments Information Act. And with this act, they sort of ushered in an era of focus on improper payments. And this is spanned, as you'll see, from George W.'s administration through the Obama administration. And as part of this, unemployment insurance was identified as a program that had a propensity to have high errors. And so it was one of the programs that was selected by the OMB to have additional oversight on with respect to improper payments. And so the Department of Labor, in responding to this, and you'll see why a little bit later on, why they had to take some specific steps, issued a program letter in 2011 to try a variety of strategies to lower improper payments in unemployment insurance. And the basic question we want to answer in this paper is, did these strategies work? Okay? So a little bit more about unemployment insurance, in case you're not aware of the details. It's also known as the Federal State Unemployment Compensation Program. And the reason it's called this is that it's very much a hybrid between federal oversight and state implementation. So there's some interesting, if you're interested in implementation things, there's some interesting pieces I'll allude to that we don't really get into in our paper, but it's policy set at by the federal level and then implemented at the states. It's created in 1935 along with the Social Security Act. It's supposed to serve as a first line of defense against those who are having economic hardship. So it's the primary program for serving as a buffer or protection if you lose your job and are out of the labor market. And an important piece that is sometimes missed in discussions of unemployment insurance is not only is it an insurance program, but it only provides temporary assistance. The amount varies by state. We have a little bit of wiggle room there. And people who lose their job through no fault of their own. So this doesn't apply if you quit or if you're fired, okay? So to give you a little bit more detail about the federal versus state relationship here, the federal responsibilities include a list here that you can see. I'll just kind of quickly go through them. The first one is ensuring conformity, that the states are actually in line with the federal policy, so that they haven't gone rogue and done something that they're not allowed to. They determine the amount that's required to keep the administrative side of unemployment insurance running. They provide, and then they use that fund to provide money to the states to provide the administration of the program. And they set the overall policy. They monitor states' performance, which is what some of the stuff we're going to get into with our data, and provide technical assistance as needed. And again, they hold and invest all the money in the unemployment trust fund. So you have money that's going towards administration, and then you have money that's being collected directly for benefits. And they actually, they kind of take care of both of those sets of money. Okay, the states are sort of more the on-the-ground party in this. They have a sort of a decent amount of flexibility in both their benefits amounts and how eligibility is determined. So the states are responsible for setting up the benefit structure. How is it calculated? How much do they get? They set this tax structure for the taxes that are going to be on employers and the amounts that that's going to be and how that works. They determine all the operation methods and how to administer the program, where their offices are going to be, what all of that looks like. They're the ones that actually process the claims when someone applies for unemployment insurance. They, again, determine eligibility. They have to work hard not only to keep improper payments low, but also that the claims are paid in a timely fashion. They determine which employers are eligible, and they do the on-the-ground collection of the contributions, even though the federal government kind of manages once it's deposited, they do all the direct collection of the money. So what is unemployment insurance? What's their relationship sort of over time with improper payments? So to kind of set the stage, there's always been sort of issues anecdotally with unemployment insurance and improper payments. And so this goes back all the way to the mid-70s, people hearing enough about it that there was a study commissioned. It was called the National Commission on Unemployment Compensation. It was conducted in 1979 and 1980. And essentially what they found is that unemployment insurance improper payments were vastly higher than they had even expected. So magnitudes of 30 and 35% of the amount of dollars being paid out were improperly paid. And so the Department of Labor tried to find a variety of ways to deal with this and continue to monitor this in a systematic way. And the program they settled on in 1995 was the Benefit Accuracy Measurement Program, which I'll tell a little bit more about that when we get to the data. But essentially every state by statute has to have a division that randomly samples a number of unemployment insurance claims every week to determine whether or not they were properly paid out or not, or properly denied or not. And they've been running this since 1995 with some few modifications, but with basically this random sampling strategy since 1995. And at the time, it made them a leader in federal programs of analyzing their own performance data with respect to improper payments. Because as you'll see, 1995 is still a number of years before the first federal legislation directly addressing this in 2002. And so then the federal government did start to put an emphasis on this. As I mentioned earlier in the introduction, there's been several federal statutes that have worked to find ways at the federal level to lower improper payments across the government. And the first one was in 2002 under the Bush administration, which was Improper Payments Information Act of 2002. Then there was nothing else sort of done under statute under the Bush administration. But in 2009, President Obama issued an executive order, again, highlighting the importance of trying to reduce improper payments. The big piece that sort of changed a little bit about how this was done is the IPER, which is Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Act. It's probably not how you say that. IPERA. And so what you'll see here in a moment, this sort of changed the obligation that the federal agencies have and the level of responsibility they have with reducing improper payments. There's been another follow-up there that the Improper Payments Elimination and Recovery Improvement Act. These often just change a little bit of language in the previous one. That's what this act did, to sort of clarify some questions. And then to actually lay out how agencies are supposed to deal with improper payments, the OMB issued this Appendix C to Circular Number A123, and they update it as necessarily. And this is sort of the nitty-gritty of, from a statistics standpoint and from a design standpoint, how are the agencies supposed to collect this data and process it. So I alluded that the IPRA was sort of really a game changer in this, and the reason that it is they put some more strict rules on the level to which federal agencies have to be concerned about improper payments. And they picked sort of a random, it's not really random, but I don't know if there was other good justification for it, is this 10% improper payment rate. And if programs, as you can see here, if a program is over 10% of improper payments, of the amount being paid out being improper, they're out of compliance with the law. Okay, and if it's determined to be out of compliance in year one, the federal agency head has to submit a plan to Congress on how they intend to improve the program. So any program within that agency that has an improper payment rate over 10%, they have to develop a new strategy for. If it's non-compliant for 2 consecutive years, then the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, who's sort of in charge of overseeing these efforts, can obligate additional money to a specific program to help them implement compliance efforts. So if they have some ideas but they're having difficulty coming up for a funding for it, if they're out of compliance for 2 years, then the OMB can give them some additional funds. If they're non-compliant for 3 consecutive years, and this one I think is kind of interesting and quite harsh, the agency head must submit a plan to Congress to reauthorize the program. So if they're out of compliance for 3 years in a row, then they have to submit a whole new reauthorization plan to Congress, and then in the statute detail how they're going to deal with these systemic issues. And as you can see, starting in 2004, which is the earliest year for which we have this data, the blue line there is the improper payment rate for unemployment insurance, and you can see for every year from.
Sorry, Dr. Bullock, what does an improper payment look like in the context of unemployment insurance? So, sort of an example to sort of illustrate.
Yeah. So, and we'll get to the main causes of improper payment, specifically on unemployment insurance, in a moment. But for example, if someone continues to claim benefits after they've gone back to work, that's improperly paid because it wasn't caught. If you get payments even though the reasons for which you were released or separated from your job weren't reasons that the state actually recognizes. So it can be that you were maybe actually fired and that was lost in the paperwork. It can be that you were sort of continuing to file claims even though you had a job. And so those are 2 examples. Is that helpful?
To dovetail off that, Dr. Bullock, is it only in an individual context, or can it also be in administration costs?
So I'm not sure I completely understand, but tell me if this helps. So they can be errors that are done either on the employer's fault. It can be an error in filing by the claimant. It can be an error in processing by the bureaucrat. So it can be a wide array of something that the individual has done, something that the bureaucrat has done, or something that the employer has done in filing. Does that get to your question?
It does.
Okay. Okay, so as you can see here, since 2004, if IPRA had been in effect since 2004, unemployment insurance would have been out of compliance every year. They finally fall in 2013, below 10%, but the most recent numbers for 2014 just came out, and it's back over 10%, which is a little bit of a downer. Okay, so since unemployment insurance is out of compliance with this federal statute, since 10% is the benchmark, the Department of Labor drafted what they call UIPL number 19-11, which the UIPL just stands for Unemployment Insurance Program Letter. It's letters sent out from the Department of Labor to all the state offices. And in this letter, they lay the foundation or lay the framework for a couple of strategies to try to reduce these improper payments. And in the letter, they talk about what are the 4 root causes that they would like to address that are driving the majority of improper payments in unemployment insurance. And the 4 root causes that they can assess from the BAM data are payments made to individuals after they've returned to work, which is what I was talking about. Payments that are paid improperly as a result of job separation information that's either incorrect or untimely, which was the second one I mentioned a moment ago. Payments that are paid improperly as a result of states' inability to validate the claim and validate that the individuals were actually going out and trying to get jobs. And the 4th one is payments that are paid improperly as a result of the claimant failing to register with a state's employment services office. And in this particular letter, the Department of Labor decided to tackle the first 2 and the 4th root causes that are mentioned. Yes, Tom.
And are these only dealing with improper overpayment?
So no, it's overpayments and underpayments. In the study, we look at just overpayments. And the reason is that, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's like 97% of the improper payments are overpayments. So in unemployment insurance in particular, the overwhelming majority is overpayments. We look at, and remind me when I get to talking about the dependent variable, because in one we do factor in underpayments as well. And this is actually systemic of improper payments broadly throughout the federal government. So most programs, 90+% are overpayments, with a very small percentage that are underpayments. Okay, so after laying out the root causes, the program letter lays out two strategies for trying to lower improper payments in the states. And the two that they come up with in this first program letter addressing this are this cross-matching strategy, which we'll talk a little bit more about the next slide, and the adoption of this program called SIDES, which is State Information Data Exchange Systems. Okay. So the first strategy is designed to directly combat the first issue that I mentioned, which is individuals who go back to work and either underreport their earnings or don't report them at all. And the way in which this is supposed to help that is that there are individual state databases of people who have recently been hired, and then there's a national database of people who have recently been hired. And so this approach or this strategy requires states to weekly check their claimants against the national database and daily against the state database. And the idea here is that you'll catch the people who are either underreporting or not reporting their wages faster, since this is the main driver in these improper payments. The other piece about this database is it contains information about how to contact the individual if they've moved states or moved from when they submitted their unemployment insurance claim. So it's supposed to also not only find these individuals, but streamline the process in which you can let them know that there's a discrepancy. The side strategy is another information technology strategy. And here, the goal is to have a direct portal between unemployment insurance caseworkers and employers. And it allows them to more easily share information back and forth. And depending on the size of the company, if it's a very large company that hires individuals in a variety of states, they can do some direct computer-to-computer links to make it easier to share information so you don't even have to go through an online portal. And so again, this strategy is hoping to bring down misinformation between the caseworkers and the employers and allow for an easier dialogue between those two critical parties in this process. And in particular about why a claimant or why a former employee was fired or why the term is separated from work. Okay, does that make sense still? So shortly after the first UI program letter, in 2011, there was another UI program letter. And this one is UIPL number 26-11. And here the Department of Labor comes up with another strategy, a strategy that they call messaging. And this one is designed to, it's another information technology strategy that is primarily designed to deter misinformation between employees and claimants. So it's a strategy where the Department of Labor tries to get all the states on board with a uniform set of materials to provide to both claimant and employers, so that the quality of information and the clarity of the information is standardized across the states. Surprisingly, this isn't the case. Maybe not surprisingly. But so they're trying to make this information uniform so that if it truly is an issue of not understanding the policy or understanding the program, that the information's out there and available for both the claimants and the employers to be made aware in a uniform way of their responsibilities for participating in the program. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'm being reminded of an experience that I had in the workforce, and I had to deal with the Texas Workforce Commission, who I believe implements this in the state of Texas. This person was actually fired, but he still was able to collect unemployment insurance. I don't know if you're going to get to that, but I mean, having been in that situation where there was misinformation and it wasn't standardized, how can that be made clear? Do you think that there are lots of states having this problem?
So yes, I think all states are having this problem. So the issue, which I'm not going to get into it too much, this is a good time for the question, is the issue with unemployment insurance is that it's quite complex. And in the process, there are several steps at which a decent amount of discretion is exercised. And so it makes it difficult to weed all of those kinds of cases out. You can also appeal, and there's a whole process for, even though once you've been denied, appealing to try to get them. And so it is a very systemic problem in trying to identify the real, as you can see through these strategies, trying to more accurately identify the cause of job separation, and was it your fault or not. Strictly speaking, across all states, anyone participating in the program, if you are fired for cause, you cannot receive unemployment insurance. It doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, but you're not supposed to be able to get it. Does that answer your? Yeah, so I think it's an issue that all states are dealing with. And then how you define whether or not you were fired for cause or not for cause, and what does that mean, and what does that mean legally, and what does that mean in this context, is less than straightforward always. Which is something that, again, that I'm not going to talk too much about, but it's one of the reasons why improper payments are so systemic in this particular program. One of the other programs that has such an issue with improper payments is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's because it's not necessarily that straightforward, and you're relying on citizens to report how they qualify for it. And so again, this is also relying on good faith divulging of knowledge on behalf of all parties. Whereas other programs that are more standard and formulaic, like Social Security, there's still a lot in absolute dollar amounts, but the percentage of improper payments is much lower. And another example is Medicare fee-for-service, which is just drowning may be a little bit extreme, but has about $10 billion a year in improper payments. And it's again because you have a fairly complex program where multiple parties are reporting information, and they might have incentives to inflate certain things. Okay, so that's all the background on unemployment insurance, improper payments, their relationship to unemployment insurance, and sort of the policy background for how the federal government has begun to put an emphasis on this. So for the paper, we looked in the literature to see if we could find some examples of other people being interested in these issues. And the truth is, there's almost no scholarly work on specifically improper payments and also specifically unemployment insurance. They're not exactly sexy topics. And I'm surprised there's as many people here today as there is, given the title. But there's three notable exceptions. And some of these, while scholarly work, also aren't necessarily peer-reviewed. They're things that have been commissioned by, say, the Department of Labor. But the first exception is the Kingston, Burgess, and St. Louis piece. And this was these were the people who analyzed the National Commission on Unemployment. What was the NCUC? The study from 1979 and 1980 from the earlier slide. NCUC is the abbreviation, but I can't remember the full name. And so these were the individuals who analyzed that data. And what they found, which I gave the punchline away earlier, is that improper payments were even higher than they expected. I don't exactly remember all the numbers that they found, but it was much higher than they were expecting. And it was a sort of a six-city case study, and they found that across all cities, didn't matter the state and who was implemented, this was a serious issue. And the one sort of point of this piece of work is that it really highlighted that we should be regularly monitoring, particularly the unemployment insurance for improper payments. This is a bigger issue than we expected. We need to come up with a way to monitor this. And that led to, as I said earlier, to Benefit Accuracy Measurement Program, BAM, and this nice data that we have for the study today. So a second exception for someone who's done some work on this is Scrabble in 1997. So Scrabble in 1997 sort of starting to look through some of this first BAM data that's coming in and trying to figure out what's going on, what's causing these things. Now that we have this individual level data coming in every year, what does it tell us? And they found that in the mid-90s, the overpayments were resulting from 3 broad categories of overpayments. And the first one is the monetary determination level, how much money the person should be paid. That was 11% of overpayments. The second one is separation decisions, which was about 16%. Again, whether or not you were actually fired or you left and it wasn't your fault. And the big one being continuing eligibility violations. Okay, and that's the bigger word for this idea that people are continuing to claim benefits after they have a job. And of the continuing eligibility concerns, the most important violations in Scrabble study were having excess earnings reported during the benefit year. So the year in which you were receiving benefits, the unemployment insurance benefits are a function of how much money you were making before. And so these were inflated so that people would receive more money. And the other one is registering with the job service. So these are what Scrabble was finding in 1997. As his takeaway walking through this, he's also done a lot of work on unemployment insurance and is still active, does some stuff now as well. He highlights the role that essentially information technology can play, how computerized wage records can help in accurately determining monetary determination levels. That was a shocking conclusion in the mid-90s, apparently. But this was a piece that he's starting to highlight some of the strategies that the Department of Labor is using in 2011 for this study, okay? The third and final piece that serves as sort of a notable exception to people doing work on improper payments and in particular in unemployment insurance is a piece by Jeff Winger and Vicki Wilkins from the University of Georgia. And they examined, using the BAM data, how automating the process for applying for unemployment insurance can lead to better outcomes for certain types of disadvantaged groups or certain types of groups that might feel discriminated against otherwise. And so what they find is that specifically if a claim is filed via the telephone, because this is an option, you don't have to meet with a caseworker, at least for this part, it increases the access that women have to unemployment insurance. They are less likely to be improperly denied, which is another piece of the benefit accuracy measurement program. It collects this data on when people are overpaid or underpaid, but it also collects this data on whether or not they were properly or improperly denied. And so these pieces are sort of, the common theme through them is this idea that maybe automation, information technology, minimizing discretion can help lower the incidence of improper payments. And in particular, 2 types of strategies. We talked about the computerization that Scrabble talked about and automation that Winger and Wilkins were talking about. And so this idea of making the communication between these major parties smoother, more reliable, more based in facts, the little bit of literature that we have does suggest that this might be helpful. Okay, so on to the data. So I've been talking about this benefit accuracy measurement program, which is BAM. And BAM is administered by the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration office. And essentially the way it works is each state has a state workforce agency, and they have to select a certain amount of randomly select a certain amount of claims, unemployment insurance claims, to go through and do a very thorough, detailed audit on the claim and whether or not it was paid properly. If it wasn't paid properly, why wasn't it paid properly? Whose fault was it? The amount of variables or amount of things that they do in these audits is pretty lengthy. It's over probably 100 different things that they're having to assess. It makes the data fun to work with. That was a bad empirical researcher joke. Man. Okay. So keep going. The BAM investigators audit, as I mentioned, both paid claims and whether or not they were paid properly, and denied claims, claims that were denied and whether they were denied properly or not. And they have a set amount that they have to audit every week to be generalizable to the population of the state. So for our study in particular, we use the BAM data from all 50 states from 2004 to 2013. And the idea here is to capture a few years before the program letter and the state started implementing these strategies in 2011, 2012, up through 2013. The reason that we only go through 2013 is until a couple days ago, 2014 data wasn't available, so I couldn't use it. But we'll be updating that with this in the review process, I imagine. We also merge in a few other variables outside of the BAM data that I'll talk about in just a second. But to get to Dr. Barefield's question earlier about how the improper payments are sort of measured and whether it includes overpayments or underpayments in the study, we use two different dependent variables, as you'll see moving forward. One is the improper payment rate. Okay, and the improper payment rate is the absolute value of both overpayments and underpayments added together divided by the total number of dollars paid out. So it's a percent, and it creates underpayments and overpayments as positive values. Again, the underpayments are a fairly negligible amount. The other piece that we do is to look at the improper payments per capita to sort of adjust them for state size. Our main explanatory variables are each of the strategies. So this cross-matching strategy, whether or not the states, when they implemented that, the side strategy that I spoke about earlier, and the messaging strategy. So these are just, for those of you that have had the statistics classes, these are just dummy variables. They become a 1 in the year in which this was implemented, and we're trying to see if in those years it helped lower the improper payments. The other variables that are in our model are the gross state product, population, the unemployment rate. All these are state level variables. The UI administrative costs for that state, political ideology. These are created using what they call nominate scores. It's a strategy that's used by several political scientists to measure political ideology in a state. The higher it is, the more liberal the state is. And then we use, as you'll see, state fixed effects. And then in one set of models, we do have year fixed effects, and in one set of models, we don't. So you'll see how that affects it. So the descriptive statistics, just to give you an idea, the average improper payment rate at the state is 11.5. The amount overpaid per capita is $14 per person. And you can see a few of the other basic statistics on the variables in our model.
Is that $14 per person per payment?
That is $14 per person total. So if you had the number of dollars that are paid improperly in the state and you divide it by the population. Okay. So it's just a population adjusted number for overpayments. And the second number, which I didn't highlight, the second dependent variable is exclusively overpayments, whereas the first one includes, the rate includes over and underpayments. And then the second one that you're going to see here in a minute, the overpaid per capita is just overpayments.
Just to clarify, it's is it for the entire state population or just the unemployed?
For the entire state population. So it's on average how much is being paid properly per person in the state. So it's just trying to adjust. It's hard to compare California's number to Rhode Island's number without adjusting by population. Not going to pick on your state. Okay. So for our, I can talk more about this for those of you that are interested in the specifics of the modeling, but essentially we use an Ols Estimator. As I said earlier, we use state fixed effects in one model and state and year fixed effects in another. And this is essentially getting at a difference of model because we have before observations and after observations. We use these standard errors called Driscoll-Cray standard errors, which have been shown in simulations to help deal with spatial cross dependence and temporal dependence. This is the most exciting slide, right? Okay, all right. So if you have more questions about that, we can talk more about that. So all this to get to the big results, and I think it comes across okay in the back. But as you can see, we have the columns 1 and 2 are for dependent variable improper payment rate in column 1 and dependent variable dollar amounts of overpayments per capita. And in these two models, they're the same set of independent variables. That what they are missing is time fixed effects. Okay, so there's not a dummy variable for every year, so we're not directly controlling for time. We have these recession and post-recession to kind of control for that in this first model. And you can see that in these first two sets, the ND&H cross-matching strategy isn't significant for the improper payment rate, but is significant and negative for the dollar amount of overpayments per capita. But the rest of our strategies are significant and negative across both dependent variables. And so the way you can read this is for example, in column 1, you have sides that on average, once sides is implemented, you're lowering the improper payment rate by 2 percentage points. No, excuse me, by 2%, not 2 percentage points. Okay? And then to control better for time, or to actually directly control for time, in columns 3 and 4, you can see that for ND&H, it's no longer significant. The sides variable is still negative and significant. Now at the 0.10 level instead of the 0.01 level, which is a big difference. And then the messaging is still negative and significant at the 0.01 level. So basically what these results are sort of saying is what we were hoping to find, I guess, is that these strategies controlling for a variety of things seem to be significantly lowering the improper payments. So for some robustness, to check to see if there are other issues with this model, thanks to some great advice by 2 colleagues in the room hanging out in the back, is what we do a falsification test. So I'm going to try to explain this, and then again, if you want more information about it, I can give it to you. So these strategies where you see it says ND&H false, sides false, messaging false. What we've done here is these things actually started being implemented in 2011, 2012, and 2013. But we're worried about if these things are just correlated, even controlling with time, with changes in time from 11, 12, and 13 on improper payments. So what we do is we take these strategies and run them as if they were occurring in earlier years, 2007, 2008, 2009. And the hope is that they won't be significant, and specifically they won't be significant and negative. Because if they're significant and negative in years in which they didn't actually occur, then it questions whether or not they're actually significant in the years when they did occur, right? And so what we find is that ND&H and sides are never significant. Messaging is significant in 2 of our models, but in the other direction, and positive. So we take that as at least some decent evidence that we're actually getting at these strategies making a difference as opposed to just trends in time. So finally, after 40 minutes, my apologies, a few conclusions. We find that on average, these strategies seem to be working. That since they're working, and I glossed over this earlier, actually I did not mention it, but the states are able to implement these in large part due to additional funds by the Department of Labor at the federal level. So we think that this is a good use of funds in terms of if your goal is lowering improper payments. And we think that continuing to better understand how to use information technology tools in the future will continue to help lower these improper payments. Last slide. We sort of hypothesize that, or sort of talk a little bit about that the Department of Labor is going to continue to have to be innovative and adopt new strategies to continue to combat this. This isn't a problem that's going away. I tend to think it's a sort of a product of design. These things are so complex, as we were talking about earlier, that weeding these improper payment rates out is going to be quite tricky. And the news broke, I guess, a week or two ago that the new numbers are out and improper payments are back on the rise, both in unemployment insurance and broadly in the federal government after falling for a few years, which is troublesome. And so these issues aren't going away. And one way that we think these things can be combated, both not just in unemployment insurance, but in some of these other programs, is better use of information technology and tracking records and using computerization to get better information to the decision makers. That's all. Thank you. Yay, thank you. So questions, we still have, even though I took 40 minutes, we still have, I think, 20 minutes.
So how much is actually spent on overpayments per year in the U.S. according to your research?
So broadly with the federal government, it's about 100 billion. Unemployment insurance, I think, is around 8 billion. But if you'll remind me, I'll look up the exact number for you. I don't have it in front of me and I just can't remember. But it's a lot. It's a lot of money.
You could actually take that and use your results to say how much each of these is saving with the back of the envelope calculation.
That's smart.
Is there any region in particular that has more fraud than others?
I've only looked at it sort of loosely. We did sort of a, it was not fancy, just sort of an eyeballing it, and it doesn't seem to be predictive of region or political ideology of the state. It seems to be issues other than that. So you have very red states that have sort of on the high end, and some very blue states that are on the high end, and the same on the low end. So I haven't yet been able to make an argument or see in the data where it's by region or size. It just seems to be a genuine administration issue.
But the population size matters, right? So the more people there are, the more likely you are to overpay.
So it is significant, yes.
So why do you think that is?
I don't know.
Do you think it's because, are these administered in offices and sub-offices around the state?
Mm-hmm.
So is it possible that there are fewer offices per person, per claimant, when there are more people?
It's so not in this study, but in another one, I've looked at whether the caseload. So it's hard to get at. So I don't have that data. I don't have how many claims each office within a state is processed.
But do you have the number of offices within the state?
No. I could probably get that, but I don't have it. So what I do have is at the state level. So in Texas, they just randomly sample 30 claims a week. And so I know from that random sample whether or not each office has an identifier, but they won't give me much more than that. So I don't have the full list. I don't have, some of that you could go and pull up, but I can't tie that to anything. So there's a chance that there's still a chance, I think, that it's a function of the amount of resources per office. But when I tested that using the best approximation of that data that I had, which is how many sampled claims from each office, which is problematic, it wasn't significant. So the amount of claims that are being sampled from an office isn't a predictor of the occurrence of improper payments.
I would think that the caseload would be though, right? So the number of offices per population, per capita.
So I've run it with the number of initial claims in a state. It's not significant. So I don't have it, but I don't have a good measure by sub-office within state. I have a good measure of the number of claims per state, and that doesn't seem to be predictive of it. And then I have this rough, not good proxy measure for whether the amount of caseload in offices that are sampled, and that the measure I'm using for the number of caseload is the number sampled. Okay, so there's lots of issues with this, but it doesn't seem to be significant in those places that we've run. I'm with you. It seems like, and I even hypothesize that some of these resource factors should matter. I haven't found evidence for that yet.
Question on, because a lot of the information is self-reported, do you have any information on penalties, and are penalties controlled at the state level?
I do have information on whether or not the improper payments, how much they were, and whether or not they were recovered. I don't have information on how the people were penalized.
So, and the reason I ask, so let's say, and I'm spitballing here, so I can be completely out of it. Let's say there is recovery and a fine. And because so much of this is going to be dependent on information, the inputs that go in, could we see variation based on the fact that places where there are heavier fines, people are less likely to sort of fly? And I was also wondering, is there a distribution about sort of who fudges?
So, yes, there is some information on who fudges. And that was a big part of my dissertation, was trying to identify who fudges more. There's some evidence that it matters both by race and sex. It's not a claim I'm comfortable making because I want to surely rule out all other hypotheses before I say X group.
And I guess I was thinking more about sort of the amount that you would receive. So if I am less liquid, then I may be more inclined to fudge, or maybe I'm more liquid and I just think I'm smarter than there's going to be problems.
Yeah, there's some, when I've analyzed the individual, so this is state level data. I've analyzed the individual level data over 10 years. There's about 220,000 claims that I have available. And there is some real differences between wage, sex, education, and race. So until, I'm sitting on that paper until I can be pretty comfortable with what that means. But yes, there is differences by group.
So, and I don't mean to take it away from here. Sure. And leading back into this, wondering if those would influence. So, is it size, or is it this other thing that's going underneath that? Penalties that could be paid, or amount that's recovered, percentage of things that are recovered that would also influence what you're reporting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So the penalties, the severity of the penalties could be one thing driving this, as could be the demographic makeup of the state. There is, so just an anecdotal story. I presented the individual level stuff at EGPA, European Group on PA, in 2013. And there was a Swiss scholar there who did some work on improper payments and unemployment insurance in Switzerland. And to get at sort of the incentives, which I think is some of what you're getting at, they have an underpayment problem. And they have an underpayment problem because if a government worker or a caseworker is found overpaying, it comes out of their paycheck. So then they sort of change the incentives there, and they have their own issue now, which is not giving people the amount they're supposed to get. So yeah, I think there's certain, I haven't tried to go through and find what the penalties are by state, but that could be an interesting piece driving this, as well as I think, even though it's not popping out significant, having in this idea of caseload. The other piece that, to keep poking holes in my own research, that I think is problematic and something that I haven't come up with a good solution for, is each state is independently auditing these things. So it might be that the caseworkers in Texas are really aggressive because we really care about fiscal responsibility, and so they are just, the people hired to do this are go-getters. Whereas someone in California maybe just doesn't care as much, they're not as diligent, there's not as much pressure on this, and so they don't find as many. Data's messy, but it is an interesting piece that the sort of auditing arm that I'd like to look at someday to see if that's driving some of this as well. And then I'll come back, sorry.
probably more where you're gonna look there, but something that I was informed by from TWC was that they actually hire a third party to handle all of these things. And I didn't know if that was something common, or if that's something that, are these third parties, you know, are they accredited by the federal government to say that yes, you're approved and you're allowed to do this, and that you will be consistent in behaving with other states, or?
The short answer is I don't know. The broader answer is it's always talked about as if they were actual Department of Labor employees at the state, not contracted out. So it's interesting, I didn't know that. But it'd be interesting because another piece of this is how the auditing function, right? So for Medicare and Medicaid, they use different, they do contract out how to find these. And one of the contracting arrangements is you get paid based on the number of claims you find and recover. Well, it's maybe not surprising that they're going to find more errors than someone else. So there's really something to this auditing piece that I'm not able to quite get at yet.
So Justin, I had a big picture question for you. So I always think it's important to cross literature. So I'm thinking of the general public, going from general public management literature into general management literature. And what can we learn about errors in employee performance in, you know, making a widget, errors making a widget, sort of that classic Frederick Taylor stuff that informs why some of these interventions work and don't work. Do you draw upon that literature at all?
Not in this piece, I don't. The piece that I intend to look in, or was intending to look into, is the role in which specifically information technology plays in the private sector as well, in dealing with errors. What's tricky about that individual level sort of motivation, individual level incentive structures, I don't have good data for looking at that because I don't know anything about the office in which these errors occur. And so it would be, I mean, I could tie it in and talk broadly about it because I know a lot about the types of errors that are being made. And so you could tie it in that way. I know sort of from a breakdown what kinds of errors are making and who's making them. The issue from sort of an empirical standpoint for like testing it or working some of those hypotheses is I don't have the data. Which is why it would be interesting to, there's some really interesting representative bureaucracy questions here. But I don't know anything about the bureaucrats, nothing, other than that they work for a sub-office in Texas.
I know in Massachusetts, you can do all of this online. So you never see a person in an office, you never talk to anybody, you just register and start getting your checks, everything online. If we do everything online, does that make for fewer errors? So I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. I have that. I have that data. It's broken down by type of filing method, and the filing method matters. So there are more errors with different types of filing methods. I can't off the top of my head remember which ones have more or less, but it does, in those models, one for the dissertation, I break down each potential filing method because the audit tells how they filed and whether or not it had more or less errors, if it was a predictor of occurrence of an error. They were significant, although I just don't remember which ones had more or less.
Let's have a clarifying question. So the 10% figure they came up with as a standard, is that arbitrary or was that?
I believe that it's arbitrary. I don't actually know. I haven't read the proceedings. I've read through the statute where they lay it out, but they just sort of exogenously pull it and say 10%. And I think it's because a lot of programs fall under that, and a few big issue ones fall above that. And so I think it was a way, if I had to guess, complete speculation, but if I had to guess, it was a number at which, I mean, when you look at the average improper payment rate across programs, it's something like 8 or 9%, so it comes in below that. But then you have these high error programs that are coming in just above it. And so my guess is it was some balance of here's what the data's already shown. We don't want to put everyone out of compliance, but we want to find ways to encourage these big error programs to bring it down. But that's all just speculation.